I am the first memory. In Edgehaven, they say silence is a sanctuary. They are wrong. Silence is a slow-growing poison. The village believes they have traded a girl's life for their own safety, that by casting Kaelin into the thorns, the grey rot would simply wither away. They are fools. You cannot heal a wound by cutting out the heart. Today, the sun rises on a dying world, and those who stood silent find that their cowardice has saved no one. New to the record, you must see the fire that burned the pact. Chapters 1 through 3 are waiting for you here. You cannot understand the cost until you have seen the crime. For the rest of you, listen to the silence. It is heavier than you think. This is Chapter 4, The Weight of Silence.
The fire in Ilara's fireplace had died hours ago, leaving behind a mound of cold, gray ash that felt like the heart of the morning. It was a hollow dawn. The light filtering through the grimy window did not carry the promise of a new day. Instead, it was the sterile, flat light of an ended one. It crept across the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air, and fell upon a small empty stool. The stool was a simple piece of wood, with 3 legs worn uneven by a lifetime of use. The seat was scarred and dark. In the stillness of the cottage, its emptiness was a physical presence, a void that seemed to pull all warmth and sound into itself. Yesterday, it had been a place of quiet questions and shared tea. It had been a sanctuary for a lonely girl finding a moment's peace in a world that offered her none. Today, it was a tombstone. Ilara stood with her back to the cold ashes. Her old bones ached with a weariness that had nothing to do with her age, and everything to do with the soul-deep exhaustion of grief. Sleep had been a stranger. It was a mercy she could not afford, a quiet pasture where the nightmare of the previous evening would surely have been waiting to graze. Instead, she had watched the moon trace its lonely arc across the sky. Each passing hour was the tick of a clock counting down to a dawn Kaelin would not see. She moved stiffly. Her usual sharp energy was replaced by a slow, methodical wade through heavy mud. The comforting chaos of her cottage offered no solace. The bunches of dried herbs hanging from the rafters resembled sleeping bats. The stacks of cracked leather books and jars of colored powders were now just clutter, the meaningless debris of a life that suddenly felt too long. Her hands, once sure and steady over a mortar and pestle, were now unresponsive and cold. They shook as she reached for the ceramic jar of bitter root. She didn't want the tea. The taste would be like ash in her mouth. But the simple, practiced act of making it was an anchor. It was a customary ritual in a world that had suddenly become alien. As the water began to heat, she turned to a cluttered shelf. Her fingers moved without thought, straightening a crooked fossil and adjusting a raven's feather. Her hand drifted behind a jar of dried moss, and her fingertips brushed against something small and wooden. She paused. Drawing it out, she held it in her palm. It was a bird, a tiny wren, crudely but lovingly whittled from a fallen twig. Kaelin had made it for her last week. The girl had sat on that very stool, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration as she worked the small knife. The wings were uneven, and the beak was a little too long, but the carver's affection was in every imperfect line. It was a testament to the quiet, gentle girl the village had just cast out. Ilara's throat tightened into a knot. She closed her hand around the carving, her fingers wrapping tight, forcing the sharp, unfinished edges of the wood into the wrinkled flesh of her palm. The specific pain was a welcome distraction from the vast, formless ache in her chest. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a burning path through the deep lines of her cheek. From outside, the first tentative sounds of Edgehaven's stirring began to cut through the quiet. A ragged rooster crowed in the distance, a sound of stubborn, stupid life, continuing in the face of despair. Then came the rhythmic clang of the smithy's hammer. Yesterday, it had been the heartbeat of her world. Today, it sounded hollow and accusing. Every mundane sound was a testament to a life that would go on, a life from which Kaelin had been brutally uprooted. Ilara stood frozen in the center of her small room. She was listening for the one sound she had heard almost every morning for 10 years. She wanted the soft, hesitant footfalls of a girl, coming for advice, for comfort, or for a simple cup of tea. But the path was empty. She knew with a certainty that was as cold and final as the ashes in her fireplace, that she would never hear those footsteps again. On the other side of the village, the morning air felt heavy. It was not the damp mist of early autumn, but the sterile, bone-dry scent of the gray rot. Roric stood at the edge of his family's wheat field. His lanky frame shivered, despite the wool tunic pulled tight across his chest. Between his trembling fingers, he held a single stalk of wheat. It should have been heavy with golden grain, ready for the late harvest. Instead, it was brittle and gray. As he squeezed, it turned to a fine powder that blew away in the sluggish wind. He looked down the line of the field. Yesterday, the rot had only touched the furthest boundary fence. Overnight, it had surged forward a dozen paces. An expanding ruin cut into their livelihood, like a gray scar. She is gone, Roric thought. The realization settled like a cold stone in his gut. The hagkin is gone. It was supposed to stop. That was what Elder Thane had promised. It was what Fing's father had shouted to the terrified crowd last night as the festival fire burned that unnatural green. They had blamed the strange girl with the watchful eyes. They had cast her into the bramble-bound to save the village. But the village was not saved. The rot was moving faster. Roric dropped the ruined stalk and wiped the gray dust on his trousers. But the cold remained. He closed his eyes and saw Kaelin's face as the crowd closed in around her. He remembered the raw terror in her haunted gaze. He remembered the way her gaze had found his as the circle broke apart. He felt again the sickening shame of that split second, before he had looked away. Roric had stood beside Finn. He had shouted when Finn shouted. Fear had dictated his choices. It was safer to belong to an angry crowd than to stand with the outcast. Turning his back on the ruined field, Roric began to walk. He avoided the village square where the men were gathering to debate the blight, keeping his head low as he took the narrow, overgrown path toward the forest edge. He hesitated before Ilara's heavy oak door, listening to the suffocating silence within. Finally, summoning a courage he didn't know he possessed, he raised a knuckle and tapped twice. The door swung open with an angry creak. Ilara stood there, and Roric took a startled step back. He had expected a frail, weeping woman. Instead, he saw a monument of fury. Her waxy skin was drawn tight across her face, but her magpie eyes burned with a quiet, devastating anger. "What do you want, boy?" she rasped. Her voice was as dry as dead leaves. "Have you and Finn come to throw me into the bramble-bound too?" Roric swallowed hard, his throat clicking. "No, Ilara. I came from the fields." He looked down, his fingers fumbling against one another. "The rot, it's worse today. It took a whole row of our wheat overnight." Ilara did not look surprised. She let out a short, bitter sound that was entirely devoid of humor. "Of course it is worse. You fools cut out the only root holding the soil together. And now you wonder why the earth is crumbling." "I didn't," Roric started, his voice cracking. He looked up, his eyes pleading. "I didn't throw her out. It was Elder Thane. I didn't say anything." Ilara leaned forward, her small frame radiating an immense, crushing weight. She looked at him not as a boy, but but as a symptom of the village's sickness. And that is exactly your crime, Roric, she said. Her voice dropped to a terrifying hiss. Finn is cruel, but he is honest in his cruelty. You? You knew she was innocent. You knew it was wrong. You stood there and watched a girl be thrown to the wolves because you were too frightened to open your mouth. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The pale shame he had felt last night bloomed into a full, suffocating guilt. She didn't cause the rot, Roric whispered. Tears of self-disgust finally stung his eyes. We were wrong. I know, Ilara said. Her hand gripped the edge of the door. And the tragedy, boy, is that you knew it last night. Without another word, Ilara stepped back and slammed the door. The thud cut through the stillness like a blade, leaving Roric standing alone on the overgrown path. He stared at the closed wood as the sterile odor of the gray rot clung to the air. Edgehaven was dying. The forest was a wall of terrifying shadows. For the first time in his life, Roric realized that silence had not made him safe. It had only made him a coward. He turned back toward the village, his hands curled into trembling fists.
Remorse is a heavy burden to carry into a dying winter. Roric has found his voice, but a confession cannot put the heart back into the forest. While the village withers, Kaelin walks deeper into the emerald shadows. She has survived the stones and the mirror, but now she must face the one who has been waiting in the dark. Do not let the silence take you. At the foundation of this record, I have left the Guardian Quiz and the Collector Pack. Claim them now, before the light fails. I remain the first memory. Watch the shadows, for they are watching you.